good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone had a great lunch and a nice respite from some of the content. We are back at it here at the 2022 INCOMPAS Show. Again, I'm Chris Shipley with INCOMPAS, and today I'm going to be leading a panel entitled "Mind the Gaps: Making Robocall Mitigation and Call Authentication Obligations Work for Industry and Consumers." And I've got a great panel today, but let me just sort of set the stage here just a little bit. Last year, we were in Vegas. We were coming to the end of a series of rulemakings and proceedings and reports, and I think it was almost, what, 2-3 dozen different items that the Commission, the FCC, required coming out of the Trace Act and the obligations from the Trace Act. And I think at that time I said, we have reached an inflection point. The Commission needed to give some pause here, think about what needed to come next. And over the last year, I think we've come to a point where we've started to identify some of the gaps. And now it's time to have a discussion about how to fill those gaps. How do we make sure that the frameworks and the solutions that we're putting in place are working for everyone, and that we're able to protect the legitimate traffic that's going on while taking care of the illegal robocall campaigning that's still, according to the FCC, just the scourge of voice service networks nationwide. I am honored to be joined by a very distinguished panel today. I thank you all for being here. To my immediate left is Jim Tyrell from TNS. He's the Vice President of Product Management. To his left is Greg Rogers of Bandwidth, the Head of Global Policy and Regulatory Affairs. And then to his left is Michael Pryor, who's a shareholder at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. Michael also represents the Cloud Communications Alliance, with which INCOMPAS has a partnership, and the CCA and INCOMPAS have worked basically all year long on a number of robocall mitigation issues, and it is my great pleasure to have all three of you here today. So thank you for being here. Let me get started by asking each of you just to take a minute or two, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about your companies, and then the challenges that your customers face with respect to illegal robocalls. Jim, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. This is a timely topic as usual. I work for Transaction Network Services. We provide the call analytics to some of the very largest carriers within the United States, as well as about 120 other, really smaller carriers. And so, Verizon Wireless is our largest customer, and we have two of the larger cable companies as well. So, on the one side, we're trying to protect those subscribers for the carriers. On the other side, we've now gotten into the space of branded calling, enterprise branded calling, to try to help, get to be able to have the legitimate call originators, be able to display, some rich content. And what we've seen so far is a very good, pickup ratio. The answer rate goes up fairly dramatically for those customers. And so, again, it's kind of a balancing act that we play on, trying to make sure that the good guys get through, the bad guys get blocked, but, we always don't get it. We always don't get it right, but we get it right, the majority of the time, or most of the time.
Greg, I forgot to mention that you represent INCOMPAS on the STIGA, which is the industry-led effort to put STIR/SHAKEN in place. I just want to recognize you for that. Thanks again for another great year of representation of INCOMPAS on that board and for all of your hard work. Thank you, Angie. Yep. In terms of trying to get STIR/SHAKEN in place, we'll talk about that in a second, but tell us more about Bandwidth and the work you do.
Okay. Greg Rogers. I head up our global policy, regulatory matters, and have been at Bandwidth for now 12 years. We are a CLEC nationwide. Domestically, we've also now expanded in my title globally, where so STIR/SHAKEN and robocall mitigation is now a global issue, and with customers that we serve, looking to take what are IP-enabled, platform-based, software-enabled services to enterprise end users globally. Big, end user customers that may be resellers, but maybe more typically kind of in the software space. Historically, we've had a long-standing relationship with Google, for example. And so Google is somebody who started out with a Google Voice service that Bandwidth is a wholesale provider. We provided the CLEC interconnection and traffic exchange. They're looking to provide a whole host of IP-enabled, software-enabled communication services in a platform manner and in different kind of ways to different end users. It's not a uniform sort of communication service in a traditional wireless end user way. It can be packaged and presented and consumed in a large variety of ways. And that's just one instance, right? And you can take Google and you can go all the way down to new, innovative, entrepreneurial, IP-based services around the globe. And we're there trying to help support them with their communication services in most respects as a wholesale underlying carrier. And how we are able to kind of represent those interests, I think, in the larger ecosystem in a policy way is trying to have an ecosystem where people can trust telephone numbers, trust what they're sending will get through, trust what they're receiving is a good call that they want. Those are the kinds of things that we're really focused on and trying to support on behalf of that customer set that I've sort of generally described.
Sure. Now, Michael, I also failed to mention with you that in addition to representing Cloud Communications Alliance, you also represent a number of callers. And so obviously, I would love for you to talk about not just the Cloud Communication Alliance's experience here, but also callers as well.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for inviting me again. And I'm really glad that we're in Denver because my firm's main office is 2 blocks away, so I got another excuse to go check out and see my colleagues. So the Cloud Communications Alliance is actually made up of a lot of folks that Greg was just talking about. These are newer, smaller entrants that provide software-based platforms for enterprises that combine a lot of different communications capabilities. Collaboration, presence, integration, conferencing, CRM, customer experience. They package these often in proprietary platforms. They are over-the-top providers. Their customers bring their own broadband, and they're over-the-top and they provide those services. And in this space, I think we've been focused on a couple of things. One is to make sure that they can participate in these frameworks in a way that's not overly burdensome to them. And we also want to make sure that their customers' calls, legitimate calls, get completed. And we've been very happy to do this in our collaboration with INCOMPAS, where we also have sort of a very fundamental issue, which is we want to make sure that as all of these programs and obligations are rolled out, they're done in a sort of non-discriminatory, anti-competitive way. And about 1/3 of the CCA's members are foreign-based, so they're very interested in what's going on with this globally and what the FCC is trying to do in terms of blocking calls coming in from overseas with US numbers and the caller ID. So that's sort of the cloud group. The other group, so I've got kind of one foot in the provider world and one foot in the caller world, and I've worked with an informal coalition of some of the biggest trade associations in Washington, whose members are all consumer-facing. Associations like the American Bankers Association or the credit union associations in different kind of finance sectors, health sectors, the utilities, and they all kind of have one thing in common, which is they need to be communicating and talking with their customers. So one of their primary interests here, particularly as blocking has progressed to use of reasonable analytics, is to make sure that their sometimes robocalls, and remember robocalls are not illegal, but there are some illegal robocalls, but not all robocalls are illegal. Their calls get through, they don't get inadvertently blocked, and if they do, that there's redress mechanisms available and so forth. So that's sort of the two places where I've been working on this issue.
So we seem to have an annual robocall panel, and I think we're going to continue to have one until I can look my mother and father in the face and tell them robocalls are effectively mitigated. Because they always ask me every single year. So I'll know exactly when it'll be time to wrap up these robocall panels, when they stop asking. One of the primary things that we've been talking about every year is stir shaken. Stir shaken allows an originating call service or voice service provider to share what it knows about caller ID information down the call path. And it's a key part of the Commission's efforts to eliminate or mitigate illegal robocalls. In August, the Commission issued a public notice seeking comment essentially on the efficacy of the framework. This was an obligation of the Trace Act. It has to complete this assessment. So let's start right there. Each of you has dedicated hundreds, thousands of hours to this issue over the last couple of years. How would you assess the framework's effectiveness? And I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about revising it or replacing it a little bit later, but just from where we stand right now, how would you assess its effectiveness? Jim?
Yeah, so I'll start. Yeah, I think Chris, it's gotten off to a good start, and I would really emphasize it's a start. Yeah. Because the data that we see, again, we see data across hundreds and 400 or 500 of carriers within the United States that have cross-carrier traffic. So that's why we're allowed to, or that's why we can do call analytics. We see traffic from the likes of Bandwidth, Peerless, all the big guys, all the small guys, because we provide network routing and those types of services. And so the data that we have that we've seen is that about 63% of all of the wanted intercarrier calls, have a A-level attestation associated with them, so they were signed as legitimate. So that's a great start. Almost 2/3 when we looked at the numbers, back at the end of last year, it was probably around 30%. So you can see that the efficacy of what the FCC asked people to do, they actually did. Now, the challenge and the reason that I say it's a good start, this is some other numbers that we've published, and it'll be coming out in our robocall investigation report, but we put it in our response to the FCC is that we're seeing invalid numbers that have A-level attestation. We're seeing malformed numbers that have A-level attestation. We see DNO that have A-level attestation. So that's a big challenge. The framework is supposed to say, hey, if I give A-level attestation, I know that the customer has the right to use the number, and I know who the customer is, right? Okay, so if you've got an invalid number, how do they have the right to use that number? And some of that may be, kind of cleaning up the ecosystem, whether, they're sending it in an E164 format or not, which is what the standard says that they should be doing. But that's a real challenge. And part of what we see too is, okay, so where are those, where are those numbers, kind of coming from? They're typically coming from a VoIP provider. And so hence why I think the FCC said, let's move up the implementation of the Trace Act, a year to those guys. So it's a good, it's a good start. We also see, I think kind of the third thing that we'll see is that they will buy telephone numbers from, hundreds of thousands of telephone numbers from certain providers. And the challenge there is A, why do you need a couple 100,000 numbers to make telephone calls? I think that's kind of a question that the FCC should kind of look at. But what they're doing is they're rotating through those hundreds of thousands of numbers and using ultra low volume spamming, snowshoe spamming. They'll maybe make 5 calls from one telephone number, move on to the next telephone number, and so it's difficult. It makes it more difficult for the analytics engines to be able to be able to take the wheat from the chaff, if you will. And so, you know, so I think it's a good start. You know, where the challenges are is, I think, you know, some of the people that have signed up for STIR/SHAKEN, you know, have maybe are abiding by the letter of the law rather than kind of what the spirit of the law is. And so that, you know, that's I think the challenge. But again, it's a good start. STIR/SHAKEN does help it make it easier to get back to the originating carrier quicker. I just think that we need to start kind of looking at all of the data that, like, you know, the U.S. Telecom and the ITG group looks at and says, are we seeing any kind of common themes within these big data? And let's just narrow in on those rather than kind of creating more and more regulation. Is kind of where, you know, I think that we kind of need to, you know, kind of break the FCC a little bit into let the system work itself out first.
Sure.
Greg. So I might just observe a few things just in that brief conversation. Chris, you started by saying it seems like we've been at this for a long time. And then Jim says we're right at the start, right? And I think both of those things are true at the very same time, right? And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind is that so much of this that happens in the space that we operate is that way. It seems like we've been at it for a long time, and yet we're still at the start right now. That was true, one of the things that you observed about numbers. So the FCC in 2015 decided to open up numbering access much more broadly, pulled back on previously more restrictive regulations, and said, you know, we don't think there's really any concern here with giving access to all comers effectively, and to people who may not necessarily have, you know, been steeped in telecom regulatory experience. And it took that long for people to witness that, oh no, there's a lot of people out there doing things with software-enabled services that don't really know what they're doing. They can do it. It's technologically feasible. We can do it. To then go back and try to address those things that occurred over time and fix those things is going to take time too. STIR/SHAKEN, you know, was a spec that got developed, took time to develop the spec, implementing the spec, and then getting people to operate according to the spec is an evolutionary process. It's going to take a considerable amount of time, I think, for it to be ultimately as effective to the ultimate purpose that you said was to get A-level attestation. But you're dealing with people who aren't steeped in regulatory issues, who are now being expected to understand regulatory telecommunications law at a level, you know, to know that they have to deploy this in their service, to sign their calls in this way for them to work. There's a lot there. I mean, it's a very complicated set of you know, interoperable considerations. So one of the challenges in that evolutionary process is that people want, like your parents, want it fixed yesterday, right?
Right.
And so then enforcers come along and say, hey, why isn't this fixed yesterday? And your data, like sharing data, where are we in this evolutionary process? What are you seeing? What are we learning? What's working? What's not working? And to be able to have the enforcement community aware of such things, that there are improvements being made. It is progressing in a good way, in a positive way, but it's not fixed. And in fact, it might not ultimately ever be perfectly, it probably won't be perfectly fixed. The objective is, who sent me that call? Can I tell who sent that call? And if it's an illegal call, I can go enforce on that, right? I mean, that's where you want to get to ultimately, I think. So just some observations.
Yeah. And Michael, thank goodness some of those providers have you to, you know, with their legitimate use cases, to take them through some of the regulatory hurdles. What's your take on what the Commission's asking with respect to the framework's efficacy?
Yeah, well, I don't have any data points. You know, I'm interested in the numbers that you're seeing, you know, but if you think about the effectiveness of stir shaken, in my mind, you got to look at the three things that it was designed to do. One is the most obvious thing. It was designed to determine whether or not the call was illegally spoofed. Is the calling party authorized to use that number? So one question is, how good is it doing in terms of ferreting out when you've got illegally spoofed calls? The second thing it was designed to do was to be an input into the analytics. And here I have no idea how well that's working. I don't know to the extent that an A attestation being fed into an analytics engine, what effect that's having. I'm kind of hearing grumblings that, we've gone through all this, we're signing these things, doesn't seem to be doing much. And the third thing that it's supposed to do is help identify the source of the call through the orig ID. I think a process that's been somewhat overtaken by the traceback process, which kind of does the same thing, which is, trace the call back to the origination. So I think those...
Don't you think, can I just jump in there?
Oh, yeah.
I think that the promise of stir shaken is to do it in a more automated, efficient manner.
Yep.
And not the clunky sort of operational traceback that you would otherwise have to do. If you can lock in on orig ID, right?
Yeah.
And then the A attestation, B attestation stuff maybe not as critical. Orig ID is this header information that may not necessarily be being captured and utilized as effectively as possible as it could be.
But the concept of orig ID is that it's coming from a certain network element, and all the data that we're seeing, in some instances, the carrier is using only a handful of orig ID, so you know what part of the network it's coming from. There are providers out there, though, that I can tell you that dynamically change the orig ID on every single call. And so, again, it's around are you following the letter of the law? Am I putting in an orig ID? Absolutely. Am I following the spirit of the law? Absolutely not.
But from Bandwidth's perspective, and why I think it has promise, is we've approached it, we're a wholesale provider, right? So this know your customer concept is unlikely for us to know in most instances who the end user is. But we're required to have deployed stir shaken. A lot of our customers are not there yet. We're going to sign calls when we get calls. But we're also then interested in having our broad reputation in call analytics, preserved as effectively as possible. So we're going to use orig ID to identify in a anonymous manner, like who that customer is. And that's how we're thinking about it, so that that can be used, and you can do a more granular reputational treatment, reputational scoring on the orig ID, as opposed to at a broad level, at the bandwidth wholesale level.
Right.
Yeah, I think this kind of starts to touch on, maybe we'll jump ahead a little bit to some other points on this, but one of the issues I think we're going to start seeing, and you saw it some in some of the comments to the rulemaking, which is to some extent a concern about maybe grade inflation, right? A call that's getting an A that maybe it shouldn't be getting an A attestation. But one of the things you're seeing is some suggestion that the customer should be defined only as an end user. And I think that's going to maybe create some issues, because when you look at what it is that you have to do to get an A attestation, right, there are three things. One, you have to be the originating provider that's signing, you're the entity that's putting the call out into the network. Two, you've got an authenticated relationship with the customer. And three, you can verify the number. But the second prong uses the word customer, not end user. And the customer of the provider that's signing the call, the originating provider, does not necessarily mean an end user enterprise. It can be a reseller, it can be a cloud-based value-added service provider, but they are legitimately and authenticated the customer of the entity that's signing the call. And if that entity that's signing the call particularly knows that the value-added service provider, for example, has the authority to use that number because it may have assigned it, delegated that number to them, there's no reason that call can't get an A attestation. Whether that's third-party authentication or not, I actually am not sure. I don't think it is. I think it's because under the added standards, that's a customer sign, that's an originating provider signing on behalf of its customer. But if we move that, if we revise that customer definition to say only the entity that's serving the end user is the one that should be signing the call, then now you've got the cloud providers and others. Maybe now they've got to go get a token, they've got to get a certificate, they've got to be the one signing the call. That may or may not be a bad thing, I'm not sure. But the other approach that we've thought about this, and I think where you have a gap, another one of the gaps is if the originating service provider is not serving the enterprise, the caller, there is the possibility, that there's a knowledge gap. How do I know that the caller actually is a good person? I've got to kind of rely on my value-added service provider, that's my customer, to have done the know your customer vetting. And I think that value-added service provider, maybe one solution is to take that provider and say, you've got to be in the Robocall Mitigation database. You've got to be applying know your customer. Then you can continue to have this other entity, the originating provider, sign your calls. But now we've got, we've got some comfort that the caller itself has been vetted and that we can trust not just the number, but we can trust the caller.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's exactly where we're going in terms of starting to look at solutions and things along those lines. And so I want to give everybody else the opportunity, not just to respond, but in that public notice, in addition to asking about the Stir-Shaken framework and how effective it was, the Commission also pointed out that the TRACED Act obligates it to not just assess its effectiveness and then to make revisions or replacements as necessary. And so the question is, I think we've already started to get some ideas and some solutions, but I'm wondering, what your recommendations would be to the Commission, and if your advice would be to revise the framework in any way, what specific actions, would you have the Commission take to increase its overall effectiveness? And as we get into third-party authentication later down on my list, we'll just tear that question up and we'll just have that conversation now if that's part of this discussion. But who'd like to either respond to what Michael was talking about and or come with your own recommendations?
I'll be relatively brief and say I think what you highlight is the sort of multifaceted set of needs that need to come together to achieve the objectives, right, of reinstilling trust. You got to know on the onboarding process, know your customer. People need to be doing, vetting, have operational, expertise in what is the use case here, and is it one that's going to support, delivery, receipt of wanted calls, right? Or is it not? And are you registered in the Robocall Mitigation database? Right. Do you have a 499, filer ID? That's a whole set of operational requirements that support, go get your own token or sign up with somebody who might give you the capability to sign on your behalf, but also identify you uniquely, right? Right. So this third-party signing stuff gets complicated. But then you have the analytics at the terminating end that's, taking this stuff into account. You ultimately, from our perspective, you would have a feedback loop made automated, automatically available. If your calls are being blocked, tell them they're being blocked, and then you can take corrective action. Right. All of those things come together ultimately to help improve the ecosystem. So there's so many different moving parts, and there's knowledge gaps, there's experience gaps, there's gaps in the specs, there's gaps in the rules, and this again is like recognition and setting expectations that it's an evolutionary process. I think sticking with it and working your way through to try to make those improvements is going to be super important.
Yeah, I think Greg hit it on. Greg and Michael both kind of hit on. They mentioned KYC, and KYC is really, I think, the most important thing here.
Know your customer.
Know your customer, right? And so again, some of the data that we see is even with B-level attestation, I know who the customer is. I don't know whether they have the right to use that number. Okay, so then, I'll give you a perfect example. We did a trace back with a large MSO. It was a tax scam. Went back to Mexico. Guess what? There were 57% of the calls, more than half, had B-level attestation. So I know who the customer is. Okay, so you know who the customer is, you know they're calling about a tax scam, and you're allowing that traffic to then be carried into the United States. Carriers like Bandwidth will be an intermediate provider and say, okay, it's B-level, I'm not gonna block it. It seems legitimate, and then it'll come to the end user. So, I think the FCC's kind of created a good framework with the whole robocall mitigation database, and one of the things that they ask in there was, have you done stir shaken?
Right.
Check. Okay. If you haven't done stir shaken, what's your KYC program? What's your robocall mitigation plan? And I would say, even if you've done stir shaken, I would ask the same questions. What are your KYC and what are your robocall mitigation plans? Because guess what? If you don't know your customer, you could be handing out tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of telephone numbers to the devil himself, right? I mean, that can happen, and we have seen it happen. The auto warranty scam is a perfect example where they were using legitimate telephone numbers, and again, just spreading it out across lots of different telephone numbers. So I think the point that I would make to the FCC is you've got the data. Go look at the data. Do they have a robocall mitigation plan? Are they maybe as solid as a Bandwidth, for example, that says, yeah, I actually kind of pay attention to my traffic and what kind of traffic is originating and going through my network. How well do I know my customer? I'm sure Bandwidth has fairly robust, know your customer program. So I think it's just kind of getting to that next level, and that's why I think you're right. It started a long time ago, and we've still got several years to go, because you've got to kind of just weed it out. And unfortunately, your parents are going to be probably upset for a couple of years.
Oh, it's just job security for me. It means I get to keep doing this on a yearly basis.
One thing I would observe, I think as we evolve and progress in setting the expectations, is you can have a robust know your customer process and yet not have it perfect, right? And you may have instances where there's not a warranty scam going on, but unless and until somebody tells you what's going on, you're not going to know, right? You brought them on, they're up and running, and until somebody says, hey, there's a massive scam going on and it's coming from your numbers, that's the feedback loop thing, and it shouldn't automatically trigger finger pointing, throwing people under the bus that are in the intermediate space. I put you on notice. You know your customer. You said you do. Go take corrective action, and let's see some improvements. Give an opportunity to improve, right? And again, the expectation is it can't be perfect all the time, and it can't be fixed automatically all the time either.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd like to see developed more, and I think you touched on it, is branded calling or rich call data, where you can, and I think the ATA sets a standard on this as well, where you can not just display the phone number, but you can display your name or a logo or even the reason you're calling. And as long as you can transmit that additional information along the chain in a trusted way, I think your chances of getting your call answered at the end of the day are much better. You look it up and go, oh, my dentist's office is calling. So I think that process, I'd like to see more of that happening. Some providers are offering it and some are starting to pick it up, but I think as a service provider that wants to offer value to your customer, I think offering a rich call data solution might be a valuable thing.
Yeah, you definitely have to. So along with the rich call data, I agree with you. It definitely increases the trust and voice. You have to make sure that you've done the proper vetting of the customer. Make sure that they're a good actor. And then you also have to make sure that all of those calls from those telephone numbers are authenticated. And so, there's things that we're doing that are outside, that are kind of within the standards, but through the call placement server, where you're going to let me know that you're going to make a call, from this number to that number. I'm going to know that that call is going to happen, so I feel more confident that I can deliver the rich call data. Stir shaken, maybe I can, maybe I can't. I threw out some numbers that would say that some of those could be suspect, but I think that's where the industry is going to come together, figure it out, and get the right kind of solutions. And then, oh, by the way, with kind of those out of band solutions, if I see a call come from that particular telephone number, yet you haven't told me about it, well, then I know it was spoofed, and so I can knock down those calls and provide kind of a spoof detection on those customers. So I think we're kind of starting to evolve. Again, I think it's going to take a while. Branded calling, I think, will help. Anti-spoofing, detection type of solutions that'll come out into the market will help as well. It'll certainly help CUNA and ABA for sure, because those guys, because I'm sure that that their numbers get spoofed a ton.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other side of it, right? As much as callers want to make sure their calls are getting through, they are also very concerned about having their brand hijacked by a spoofer who claims they're, ABC company, and they're not. Meanwhile, ABC companies has their reputation tarnished. So they're also very interested in seeing these rules and programs work, right, to protect themselves as well from exactly the problem you just indicated.
I'm trying to figure out where we go here. I've got, the commission's got an NPRM that's just, completed the comment cycle, and I think it speaks to a lot of the gaps that we've just identified. It was talking about applying a lot of those rules to intermediate providers. It was talking about extending some of the robocall mitigation plans and know your customer rules and things along those lines. I mean, do you all have an opinion on the extent to which that NPRM might address some of these gaps? Are you, or is this the commission still, looking, sort of addressing solutions in a bit more haphazard fashion?
So I'll jump in and say I think the challenges are still the same, and we've obviously worked together to have INCOMPAS represent competitive policy positions throughout this entire thing that remain pretty consistent. Those issues are still there, which is how to advance the objective of preventing illegal robocalling and delivering, protecting consumers while allowing for innovative, competitive offerings that are, super cool, right? I mean, these rich call data features, you start baking in voice recognition as an added security measure, to banks to try to avoid people having their accounts hacked. Things like that are happening, and that's enabled by, the technology and the innovation that's there in an IP network. And all of those things are, from our perspective, we want to be there to support it because that's the business we're in, right? We're in the voice communications business, and if people aren't using their voice services, it's not going to be good for us, right? And so, while bad actors are out there and bad actors, are going to do what they're going to do, you can write all the laws in the world. If no one's going to obey them, it doesn't matter. You got to have enforcement. But it's our interest ultimately to have an ecosystem that's effective, that people want to use, right? And again, like getting back to that point and having those key fundamental positions and the focus throughout all of this, I think is super critical.
And I would never accuse the commission of being haphazard. I just think, after so many different rulemakings, I think we're all looking forward to a time where we're looking as comprehensively as possible at what it means to implement the framework. Did anyone else have any feedback, or I'm happy to move on?
Yeah, I mean, we've got, 3 or 4 open rulemakings currently.
Right.
So we're still, obviously the FCC is still at it. You do kind of get a sense that of a little bit of it's just throw everything up against the wall and see what sticks is going on. You know, so one recommendation from the FCC was, well, just make all intermediate providers sign calls. And I think we may have a difference of opinion among us about whether that's a good thing to do or not. My own view is that intermediate providers that are signing calls with C attestations doesn't further policies very much, because a C attestation doesn't tell you anything about the entities that are making their calls the right to use the number. It just says, hey, this call hit my network at some point, and here's who I am. I mean, there's a certain advantage to knowing here's who I am, but I think, you know, having a proliferation of C attestations may not be the wisest course, I think. Again, I'm going to go back to maybe the better solution is robust mitigation plans from at all layers to you know, to try to sort of monitor your traffic, identify unusual patterns and so forth, and be proactive in asking, hey, what's going on with this traffic all of a sudden? I'm not used to seeing volumes of traffic like this from you. What's going on? You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know you didn't mean haphazard, but yeah, there are.
Thank you, Jim.
It's actually tough to follow all of the open MPRMs. To be quite honest with you, you know, thank God we've got outside counsel that helps us with it. You know, again, thanks Steve Augustino, but
Jim Falvey's back there too, by the way.
Yep. Yeah, but yeah, you know, they do almost seem like now they're throwing spaghetti on. Hey, shit, you know, so robotexts are increasing. Do we need to implement, you know, stir shaking on robotexting? You know, TDM. Do we need to, you know, the whole you know, premise of stir shaking was do it on your IP network, and now they're saying, well, you know, do we need to do, you know, TDM? Now there could be a whole nother panel on IP interconnection. I think there probably has been in various forums where, you know, if you look at the small guys have said, you know, I'm mostly IP up until I hand it off. You know, come up with, you know, IP interconnect reform. I think that's what they should be looking at, rather than saying, hey, should I extend this to TDM? No, go back. They're almost like trying to use, you know, they've got this, you know, stir shaking thing out there, and it's like, let's try to use it for, you know, it slices, it dices, you know, like the Swiss utility knife, and it's like it was built for the three things that Michael talked about before.
Not that silver bullet that everyone wants it to be.
This is part of my reaction to that, is that it's all of the above, right? So it seems like they're throwing spaghetti against the wall. They are, because it's all of these things together, right? You have to solve for all of them to make it work, really, at the end of the day.
You do.
IP interconnection is so much about inter-carrier compensation. Inter-carrier compensation is all tied to TDM-based traffic exchange, right? If you can get to a more over-the-top IP, internet-enabled communications, then you can take this stuff and go global if you've got people signing A and not C, right?
Right.
I mean,
A or B. C, I agree with Michael. C is creating more C-level attestation in the ecosystem doesn't help it.
Right, but there's this whole contingent of people out there saying, oh, you can't sign B, you should be signing C. You're not doing stir shaking correctly. You're like, wait a minute. I thought the point was to say, look, I know my customer, to your point, it may not be the end user, but I do know my customer, and so I'm going to sign that B. And what's the harm in it? We're being more transparent, not less. If I were to sign that C, then you're saying, look, I don't know hardly anything about this call. So if there's a problem, let us know. We'll try to take corrective action. That's the bandwidth kind of view of it, and I think it will advance things in the direction that everyone is hoping it will, which is embracing the fullness of IP communications, which is a consumer benefit. And you can do it in a way that is coming at it from consumer protection. Like, they're trying to solve consumer protection, but if you embrace all this stuff and do it together, consumers get more out of it than just having their calls blocked.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I've got a number of topics here that we still haven't covered and I think are important. Maybe we'll do just a couple of quick answers here. I want to talk real quickly about call blocking. We've seen the commission, we've seen industry really sort of embrace call blocking over the course of last year. We've seen the FCC issue a series of enforcement actions that would require voice service providers to block calls from providers that they know are engaged in illegal robocall campaigns. Michael, you're welcome to answer this one as well, but I want it to Jim and to Greg. What's the current state of call blocking in the industry? Are we still seeing unintended consequences of having legitimate traffic being blocked? And then Jim, specific to you, how are providers like TNS using analytics and other products to block illegal, or to assist providers in blocking illegal robocalls while letting legitimate stuff through?
Yeah, sure. So that's a good question. So we are now getting more aggressive in using stir shake and input to help make decisions around analytics. We are seeing things that are saying, that doesn't quite look right for that particular call. The RIG ID, it may be the RIG ID, it may be the cert subject, could be the level of attestation, et cetera. So we are seeing that. I think that to be quite honest with you, I think the call originators are thinking more calls are getting blocked than really are being blocked. They may be being mislabeled, but from a call blocking perspective, our false positive rate, and I know I've talked to the other analytics engines as well, is pretty low. So that part's good. Where I think we could continue to improve is in the area of redress and making sure that we're not mislabeling calls. Now the FCC hasn't really kind of stepped up into that particular space, and we're kind of good with that for right now. Yeah. Again, I think we need to work collectively as a team, between the carriers, the call originators, and the analytics providers to get this right.
And Michael, I'm going to give you a chance to talk redress in just a second, but Greg, on call blocking?
I think one of the things that we experienced, in sort of recent past is call blocking and the cause code return, and whether the industry shared a common understanding of how that was working or supposed to work and what it meant. 603 plus, so mapping of things to what was traditionally the cause code that you thought it meant for us as a retry. So that one that was blocked. Maybe it's because there's a problem in the network. We're routed a different way, not knowing that whether it was or wasn't call analytics that said, no, we're making a determination to block this call, right? So that has been a shift. There was a lot of retry, a lot of capacity being chewed up in lots of different networks when that starts happening. The intention wasn't to try to find your way around the call analytics. It's just you didn't know what the call treatment was because there wasn't a good common understanding of what the cause code being returned meant. And then to the extent that you can sort that out, then you can go do something about it, right, on both ends. If you think it shouldn't have been blocked, you can take action. If you now know that it is being blocked, you can take corrective action. So more there, I think that you identified some other gaps. Labeling is a big, I don't know if it's a big issue that is still yet to come to sort of tackle.
So Michael, I think when we were here last year, we talked about 608. I think we all hoped that 608 would be the way that industry sort of approached call blocking, sort of instantaneous notification. Since then, you've really led the efforts on behalf of this partnership to ensure that 603 Plus has the kind of actionable and operable information in it to provide, providers like Greg with the kind of information he needs to seek immediate redress. What's the status of 603 Plus? Where does industry stand on its adoption? And can you just talk a little bit about those efforts?
Sure, and to sort of context, what we're talking about is if a terminating provider blocks a call based on analytics, it is required to send a notice to the originating provider, hey, I'm blocking you. The question has been, what does that notice look like? Originally, 608 was developed by the IETF, specifically designed to let you know that your call has been blocked. based on analytics by the network. A lot of problems that apparently from at least some sectors of the provider industry, they didn't like 608. They thought it was going to be too hard to implement. To convince the FCC to say, okay, in addition, if you can't send 608, send 603. 603 is not really designed for this. So the industry went back and we worked a little bit with them to say, all right, well, let's modify 603 to provide the specific information in the SIP headers that says, oh, this 603 notification is because I'm blocking you by analytics, and by the way, here's who's doing the blocking. So Addis just released that standard recently, and on its face, the standard provides the kind of actionable information that the callers or the originating providers need. Now we need to get it tested. We need to get it implemented. And right now, that's where we are. We don't have a timeline in place, so we're thinking about trying to get that put in. So we've got the standard now. Now we've got to get it implemented so it works for the industry.
Yeah. We've got time for just a couple of questions. We're over by a few seconds. Roger Fleming, this is your time to shine, sir. I didn't have a chance to get into our IP implementation question, but INCOMPAS has been engaged in an industry effort on IP implementation. We're very excited about it. And I know that you have a question about IP implementation that you'd like to ask this group.
They're shaken to work. What? IP interconnection is fundamental for stir shaken. That's my understanding.
Yep.
And stir shaken is key to the FCC. And this issue is key to the FCC. The industry's tried to work this out amongst themselves for almost 10 years now. And there doesn't seem to be a solution, 5 to 10 years. Is it time for the FCC to step in with some light touch regulatory role to force the larger companies, the ILECs, to negotiate for IP interconnection? Is it going to happen if that? Is that going to happen if the FCC doesn't act? I guess that's my question.
I'll please jump in and have. I mean, I think one of the big challenges in all of it is a political issue at the end of the day that's super hard to overcome. And that political issue is that the extremes on both sides don't want to be regulated, right? We've moved beyond, in so many ways, the old CLEC, ILEC world, and people aren't interested in going back to it. You know, to your question, should the FCC be exercising more oversight? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that all the state PUCs in every single state conducted proceedings to resolve interconnection disputes, right, that couldn't be overcome through negotiations. That was done under the Telecom Act, right? The ILECs were required to do that. Most of that process has sort of fallen by the wayside. You're left with commercial negotiations. And, you know, to your point, we've been sort of stumbling and bumbling our way through that for the last decade or so. I do think it's time for the FCC to sort of take a fresh look at it and try and figure out how to move the ball forward. You know, because without it, you're going to have the tandem providers who, for various reasons, aren't incented to upgrade to IP.
Just one observation about this as it relates to stir shaken specifically. Right, you're right. The TDM, you know, it destroys the stir shaken. It doesn't work with TDM. So there are two possible ways. One is you try to advance IP interconnection and you get TDM out of the network. I don't know how soon that's going to happen. In the meantime, there are ATA standards for alternative ways to make sure that that attestation reaches the terminating provider through an out-of-band mechanism or other, so that the fact that there's TDM in the network doesn't preclude the ability to have that transfer of information from the originating provider to the terminating provider. In our view, and maybe a little different position than others here, is the commission ought to require TDM providers to implement some sort of out-of-band solution that's already commercially available.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is stir shaken framework is only going to be as good as how far it's been deployed. And so as long as you've got gaps in the ecosystem, there are going to be gaps. The bad actors are really smart people, and they're going to figure out where the holes are. So until you get, I use the 63% number that we've seen, until you get that to like 90%, yeah, I think the FCC probably needs to do something.
Other questions? Oh, Steve Augustino.
I'll take one if I get a chance. Yeah. So the FCC required the industry to file robocall mitigation plans. Virtually all the industry did that. But it didn't take a prescriptive approach to that. So it didn't really give much guidance as to what needed to be in those plans. I want to know if you guys think that they should have, are there areas where we should have a much better idea of what's necessary or what's appropriate for robocall mitigation?
Great question.
I'll start. I think yes. I think, you saw recently that 7 providers were kicked out because, I mean, what they had for a mitigation plan were, I don't even want to talk about it.
Also, they failed to respond whenever the FCC would ask them about their mitigation.
Yeah. No, I think some more guidance would be helpful there. I think, where we're going to head is not just the folks who aren't implementing stir shaken, but everybody's going to be filing in the robocall mitigation database soon. And I think that some more guidance on what that should look like, I think would be helpful.
I think it highlights, another gap, right? Is recognition. What it demonstrated is how many providers are out there, right? And when you look at the robocall mitigation database and who's in there and who's filed what, it just screams out. There's so many people that don't know what they're supposed to be doing, right? It's hard to tell. And so some guidance, I think, would be super helpful to help people who may not have a ton of experience. They want to be in this business. They have the it's technologically feasible to participate. They think they've got great solutions, but they don't know how to navigate the regulatory landscape.
Yeah, I think the crux of Steve's question is the way they built the robocall mitigation database is almost just kind of like a flat file, if you will, rather than saying, do you have different fields like stir shaken? Yes, no, that was a question. And then it was, okay, if you don't have stir shaken, give me a PDF, right? As opposed to, okay, do you have a robocall mitigation plan? Do you have
these things?
X, X, Y, Z in these things. And oh, by the way, if you want to, you can then add a PDF that talks about, all the detail that you have, or in some instances, lack of detail.
Yep.
Thank you guys very much. We've gone over. I appreciate that. If you have more information or ideas about how you can help Encompass mine those gaps, please reach out to me. I'm always available for discussions on this topic. Please please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. Thank you, gentlemen, so much. Appreciate it.